Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down the big topics shaping our world. Today, we are diving deep into the US-China trade war, a massive economic clash that really sent shockwaves all around the globe.
And it all kind of kicks off with this tweet. On March 2nd, 2018, this message landed, and it wasn't just a stray thought, it was a signal. A huge shift in U.S. trade policy was coming, and it framed this whole conflict not just as some remote possibility, but as a fight that was, in his words, strategic and winnable.
And believe me, this wasn't just talk. Before you knew it, by the end of 2018, the two biggest economies on the planet were locked in this full-blown back-and-forth cycle of tariffs and retaliation. So you have to wonder, how did we end up at this incredibly high-stakes dinner meeting? Well, this wasn't some sudden flare-up. Nope. It was really the boiling point after months and months of economic jabs and punches that finally brought both leaders to the table. But honestly, the roots of this thing go back much, much further. To really get what's happening in 2018, we've got to jump in our time machine and rewind the clock. This trade war didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was built on 40 years of a really complicated and often tense economic relationship between the US and China. So look at this timeline. It shows just how dramatic the shift was. You go from Nixon's historic visit back in '72, which ended decades of total isolation, to China's big economic opening in '78. But the real game changer, the moment everything accelerated, was 2001. That's when China joins the World Trade Organization and just unleashes this export powerhouse. Fast forward to 2016, and what's the result? A mind-boggling trade deficit for the US. And wow, this chart right here, it just lays it all out. You can just see that green line. That's the US trade deficit with China, taking an absolute nosedive right after 2001. It didn't just grow, it exploded, completely dwarfing the deficits with other major partners like the EU or Canada. And you better believe this growing imbalance became the absolute centerpiece of the conflict. So what were the actual complaints from the US side? Let's get into the core accusations that were used to justify kicking off this whole trade war. Okay, so accusation number one, and you heard this one a lot, was all about jobs. The argument was that this constant flood of cheap Chinese products had basically gutted American manufacturing, leading to factory shutdowns and job losses all across the country, especially in the industrial heartland. 34%. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's the drop in U.S. manufacturing jobs in just 12 years. Now, what's so powerful here is that this period lines up almost perfectly with China's explosive rise as the world's factory, right after it joined the WTO. It's no surprise that this connection, this correlation, really fueled that story that one thing directly caused the other. But as always, the story is a bit more complicated. So on one hand, you've got prominent economists pointing to the China shock, blaming it for a huge chunk, at least 40% of the job losses in the early 2000s. But on the other hand, a whole lot of people were pointing to another powerful force at play. The biggest one? Automation. They argued that robots and new technology were an even bigger reason for jobs disappearing, and that just focusing on trade missed the bigger picture. In these pictures, they really tell the story of what was being traded. You see, the US is getting all this finished stuff from China. Computers, phones, all kinds of electronics. But what are we sending back? Well, it's a lot of raw materials, like soybeans, plus some really high-tech stuff like airplanes. This contrast is at the absolute heart of that one-sided trade argument. Now, beyond the jobs issue, the U.S. administration had a list of other complaints, things they called unfair, even predatory practices. They accused China of keeping its currency artificially low to make its exports cheaper, of widespread intellectual property theft, and of forcing American companies to hand over their secret tech just to get access to the Chinese market. And on this hot-button issue of intellectual property, the two sides could not have been further apart. The U.S. view was pretty blunt, state-sponsored theft on a massive scale. But China's story? Totally different. They framed it as just voluntary cooperation, arguing that American companies were actually the biggest winners, making huge profits from these partnerships. You've got two completely different narratives for the exact same set of facts. So what happened when all these accusations turned into concrete action? Well, the tough talk gave way to a full-blown economic conflict with very real consequences for a lot of people. And here's how it all went down. Kind of like a snowball rolling downhill, just getting bigger and bigger. It started in March with tariffs on steel and aluminum. China hit back.
Then in July, the US targeted China specifically, and China matched them dollar for dollar. This tit-for-tat pattern just kept going, pulling hundreds of billions of dollars of goods into the fight by September.
Now, China's response? It was smart. It was strategic. They knew exactly where to hit the US to make it hurt. And that was America's farmers, especially soybean farmers. China was their biggest customer by far, so when that market was suddenly hit with a massive tariff, exports just fell off a cliff. We're talking about immense economic pain, and it happened almost overnight. And here's the funny thing, the big irony. One of the main goals of the tariffs was supposed to be reducing that trade deficit, right? Well, in the short term, it actually got bigger. It hit $106 billion in the third quarter of 2018. So what gives? Well, a lot of experts think U.S. companies were basically panic buying, trying to stockpile Chinese goods before the tariffs could go even higher. But this wasn't a one-sided fight. Over in China, they were feeling the pressure too. The trade war added this huge external stress right when their own economy was already starting to slow down. The result? Their lowest growth rate in almost 30 years. So yeah, both sides were definitely feeling the pain. And with all this economic pain on both sides, well, it kind of forced them to the table. Which brings us right back to where we started, that dinner meeting in Buenos Aires. So they sit down and they hash out this truce. For a moment, it felt like a little bit of a breakthrough, right? A glimmer of hope. The US basically hit the pause button on more tariffs, which created this 90-day window for more negotiations. The battle was on hold, but the war was far from over. And you could see right away just how shaky this whole thing was. The US was asking for massive structural changes. That means they wanted China to fundamentally rewire its entire economy. China, on the other hand, was publicly talking about something much simpler, just buying more American stuff. That huge gap in what each side wanted showed just how hard a real permanent deal was going to be. So at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, was this ever really just about soybeans and steel tariffs? Or was this something much, much bigger? Was this maybe the opening chapter of a much longer, more strategic competition between an established superpower and a rising one? A fundamental clash over who is going to write the economic rules for the 21st century? And that is the question that continues to shape our world today.